Hello everyone and welcome back to Tactics Board. Not the most happy Norwich City fan base at the moment after a 3-2 loss to Wrexham made it 4 losses out of 4 at Carrow Road to start the season. Injury problems aplenty with Papa Amadou Diallo, the latest to be added to the injury list. We'll come to that later on, but Norwich City have the opportunity to turn things around against Stoke this weekend. Another trip on the road, and when you look at their away record so far this season, that's a reason to be optimistic, but I'm not sure there are many others going into this weekend. You know the drill here on Tactics Board. First of all, I'll give you my predicted 11, which this weekend is a pretty difficult one. Then we're going to take a look at Stoke, and then I'm going to examine some of the options to replace Diallo on that left-hand side and kind of get around his injury in a little bit more detail. So we'll get to that, but we're going to start with my predicted 11. So without further ado, here's the team I think Liam Manning will pick for Saturday's game. So I've gone with Vladan Kovacevic in goal, Jakov Medic, Harry Darling and Jose Cordoba in a back three with Jack Stacey at right wing back, Lucia Mahovo at left wing back, Mirko Topic and Pelle Matson in the centre of midfield with Jovan Makama and Mete Jarasek just behind Josh Sargent in that front three. Now, I should probably start by saying this is a very difficult 11 to predict going into this weekend. Obviously, there are the changes that Liam Manning has kind of promised and talked about from last weekend's game. He's also talked about not chasing change with too much change, was the quote from Wednesday's pre-match press conference. So it's about kind of striking that balance. But I think given some of the performances of late, as well as obviously the result against Wrexham, I think there are going to have to be a few changes to that lineup. Obviously, Diallo's injury adds to that as well, and a few reasons why I think there will be several changes. One of the players I wanted to focus on was Jose Cordoba, because I think after that performance against Wrexham, you could very much justify dropping him to the bench. But the reason why I've still got him in that 11 is that I just don't think if Norwich want to go with the back three, which I think is necessitated by the Diallo injury, they don't really have any other options that Liam Manning seems to trust. Rory McConville's minutes have been limited again so far this season. Obviously, Shane Duffy, I think, possibly still injured with that calf issue that he picked up, but obviously not really a part of the plans and has barely featured at all this season. I think only made 1 or 2 matchday squads. So then you're looking at that back three and you kind of think, what else can Manning do really, unless Kenny McLean comes back from injury, which is kind of 50-50 in terms of how Manning put it at that pre-match press conference. I don't really see who else you slot in there, and the reason why Manning included Cordoba against Wrexham, as he justified post-match, was the kind of left-footed balance. He obviously played him as a left-back, and it was a really, really tough afternoon for Cordoba, who looked very poor. But the reason I've gone for him in that position, left centre-back for tomorrow's game, is that, I just don't think there are really many other alternatives, much as Manning probably does need to send a message to a few of those players that they need to kind of improve and they need to up their levels, and one of those is Ante Sianat, who I've got outside the 11, and I think clearly he's a favourite of Manning's in terms of the quality that he brings and the talent that he's got, but it's been a very poor start to the season from him so far, not really shown any of the promise that we saw in pre-season, not built on last season at all. In fact, he's looked worse than the kind of solid enough performance he produced in his first season in a Norwich shirt. And actually Manning spoke in his pre-match press conference about kind of sending messages to players who maybe need to see that they can't get away with consistently poor performances. And although obviously I've gone with Cordoba because I don't think there are many other options, I think when you look at some of those players in that forward area, there are a couple of others who Manning could include, and I think he may well do that and drop Sianats to the bench, because he's not really bringing much to the party, as opposed to Mate Jarasek, who I've got in there retaining his place after an assist against Wrexham. I still feel like he needs to up his defensive work rate quite a lot. I think he was quite far off the pace in that sense, and didn't look like he was particularly fussed about doing the defensive side of the game against Wrexham, but clearly on the ball had a bit of that flair, wanted to create something and got into some really good positions, as well as obviously, as I referenced, setting up Jack Stacey for that goal. I've also got Jovan Makama in there, because I think he keeps delivering, and ultimately, even though this is kind of crowbarring him in a little bit, Manning sees him as a versatile force. I think if you go with Mahovo at wing back, then he offers a very attacking presence in front of him to kind of push Norwich up the pitch on that left-hand side. He's clearly very good physically, and I think in a game where maybe Norwich don't even have the players to play a kind of good in-possession, controlling style of play, and Stoke will try to make it physical as well. I think those qualities of the game kind of suit Makama's strengths. Obviously, he's coming off the back of his first goal for the club, a late consolation against Wrexham as well. So yeah, I think a few reasons to put Makama in there, and as I've referenced a couple of times, I've got Mahovo in there because Manning said he could be in a position to start this weekend. Obviously, he hasn't featured for a long time, so that maybe would be a little bit of a worry in terms of throwing him straight in away from home against Stoke. But ultimately, I don't really see many other alternatives, and we'll get into why later on in the video. On to Stoke then, and a team that have obviously started the season very well. I think if you looked at the way that they ended last season, sort of the start of Mark Robins' tenure in the Potteries, the way that they've done even over the last few years, I don't think it would be too far wide of the mark, or nobody would have thought that really going into the season if you predicted them to be kind of bottom half, mid-table. But obviously they're pushing towards the top end of the Championship, having started really well, and you can kind of see Mark Robins' fingerprints all over this team at the moment. They've, after a few months of kind of getting used to him and calibrating a little bit and working out their identity, they now look very organised in the way that Coventry did under Robins. They can attack in a really direct way, but also quite effectively. I think what you've seen from Norwich is actually trying to do a similar type of thing at times, but not really being particularly good at it, where Norwich's long balls tend to be aimless and go to the opposition goalkeeper most of the time. Stoke actually have really good accuracy with it. They have players who can play that style. They obviously bring a physical setup to the Championship, and I think in that sense, they kind of can show Norwich what they're missing a little bit. Actually, my colleague Paddy Davitt asked Liam Manning about this in his pre-match press conference, kind of the similarities between the two clubs and their slow start. And Manning did reference the fact that he feels like Stoke are a little bit further ahead of Norwich in that journey. So that's probably where the trouble comes for them in this game. I think they will need to use some of those more physical players. That's where I was kind of wondering whether Seaman would be included, because he has a bit more of that physical profile. Obviously, I referenced Makama. Josh Sargent will have to be at his best to kind of produce that as well. And it's also the sort of game where you'd like to think some of the summer recruitment like Pelle Matson, Mirko Topic, Jakov Medic will kind of show itself, because I don't think they've necessarily had the ability to, or the opportunity to, show that physical strength that they bring. And you can see from the way that they play, I don't think they've had that opportunity so much really. So although it might not be particularly pretty, I think if Stoke play the way that they want to and they do it relatively effectively and almost dominate the game, because I think that could suit Norwich given some of their injury problems, that's where maybe we'll see the more robust side of Norwich that we saw at Portsmouth, and that maybe some of those summer signings, as I said, need to show a little bit more. So it'll be interesting as a game. I don't think it will be a particularly pretty or entertaining watch, but we'll see what Norwich can produce against the Stoke side that have looked really good so far. On that mission to replace Diallo that I'm sure is buzzing around Liam Manning's head at the moment when he thinks about his team selection, I think it's a really, really difficult one. They have several options, as actually Manning referenced. I think he spoke about the fact that they have got a few players who can play in that position. He didn't feel that Diallo's injury was a result of kind of workload and playing him too much. But for me, even though there are a few you can kind of consider, I don't think any of them are either at their best at the moment or at their best in that position. Obviously, you could play Mate Jurasek out there. Previously, he has played on the left wing a little bit. Obviously, not for Norwich, given the lack of game time he's had for the club. But at Slavia, before he arrived, he was quite good at playing on that left-hand side. He's got actually quite a good natural cross into the box. So maybe with Josh Sargent and even Jovan Makama up front, it might suit Norwich to have him out there. But I think where they'd miss out is that kind of creativity, because Jurasek, when he's playing on the right, which I think is kind of recognised as his his most comfortable position, he tends to drift into that number 10 space that I keep banging on about on Tactics Board. I keep feeling like is the key for Norwich to adding some creativity into the final third and linking the midfield and the attack. He really takes up some of those positions really well. So I think you would miss out on that if you had him on the left. Although, as I said, there are some strengths to having him out there and on his more natural crossing side where he did produce some good things against Slavia. Obviously, you've got Lucian Mahovo, who I've gone for in my predicted 11, and he's also got that crossing ability. Obviously, more of a fullback for most of his career so far, but he's played as a central midfielder, he's played as a winger, so he's certainly going to be comfortable getting forward. It's just about then how you kind of protect Jose Cordoba a little bit, because I think we saw last weekend how poor he can look, to be honest, when he's exposed out wide. So maybe in that sense, although Mahovo can get forward, the fact that he provides a little bit more of that protection as a more traditional fullback in that wing-back role maybe would help him. And then you've also got Jeffrey Schlupp, who obviously is still being nursed back from injury a little bit. I think has been back in training, but maybe needs a bit more building up before he can start games. Obviously not looked particularly fit or on it so far, but you'd like to think that with a few weeks training and a bit more conditioning behind him, he could be more of an asset to Norwich, and obviously has shown that ability to get up and down at previous clubs and kind of can fulfil that wing-back role if you do want to go with a back three. I think if you keep it as a 4-4-2, that's where Jovan Makama comes in as kind of more of a winger option. Personally, I don't really see it. Obviously, he did pretty well there at Lincoln, but that's when you've got a bit more space and time in League One. And maybe as a technical player in League One, he probably stood out a little bit more. I think in the Championship, you see his physical attributes a bit more. And in a sense, he looks like more of a traditional old school number 9 who you want up front to take balls in and to win flick-ons and to win aerial balls. And I think you lose some of that out on the left unless you really want to go with a very physical setup, almost like sort of Peter Crouch under Rafa Benitez at Liverpool, that type of setup. But I don't think that really suits the way Norwich want to play at the moment. So although Makama has looked decent out wide and Manning sees him as an option across the front line, I think maybe it would feel a little bit strange putting him out there when his physical attributes are the best. So that, I mean, Ante Cianats as well in there maybe could do a job. He's played everywhere else this season and he's struggled quite a lot. So maybe try him out there where he's more naturally on his left foot. But again, I think like Jurasek, you want him in that number 10 position where he can get shots off from distance, he can find through balls and he can be that kind of presence. I don't really see him as a winger so much. So yeah, I suppose when we add up those options and you look at all of them, it does show that Norwich have a few options, but none of them are really particularly natural out there. I think there are a lot of fans questioning maybe the decision not to sign another winger in the summer, and probably that has been exposed as a pretty poor one based on this Diallo injury. Obviously, you never know for sure what's going to happen, but yeah, given the situation, it has kind of exposed maybe the lack of depth or quality in depth they had maybe, rather than simple depth out in that position. So yeah, a lot of things for Manning to consider going into this weekend's game. Obviously, the fact that they're away from home at the moment feels like it's a positive, but I think it's going to be a difficult game. So we'll see how it pans out, if they can inject a little bit more positivity into the mood. And of course, we'll have all of that covered across our channels. So go to pinkun.com/subscribe if you haven't already, and you'll have access to all of that content. Thank you very much for joining me on Tactics Board, and I'll see you for the next one.